All right, welcome back to the Compassionate Capitalist Show. Today, we're going to get into something that some people might think is boring because it's all about statistics and jobs and employment, and you hear them talking about it and they're throwing stats out. But we're going to make it really exciting and really relevant to the founders that are out there, the CEOs, the CFOs, the CMOs, the HR execs, because why are jobs and the kind of stuff we're going to talk about today? I'm kind of getting ahead of myself a little here, but I got to say, why is it important? Because I want to get your attention right now to keep listening, so that you're going to listen to the conversation that my special guest, Cary Sparrow, and I are going to talk about. Because second to competitive advantage of product market fit, everybody talks about product market fit as the biggest competitive advantage, right? This thing. But I tell you, investors look at companies and they say, team is more important than your competitive advantage of your product, because a good team can overcome shortfalls or shortages of how you go to market and these other kind of things. But that's like the core team. But when you go to growing your company, which everybody listening here, the investors, the CEOs, all know that you have to grow a company, get to a point of exiting if you're going to create unbelievable wealth as the founder of your business or an investor in a business. And so the second to the competitive advantage of product market fit is the human factor of an organization, the ability to attract and retain the right talent for the work that the organization needs to be done. When you are short workers, it impacts the productivity and the morale of the existing workforce. When you have a lot of turnover, it impacts the productivity because of the learning curve, and it is a huge soft dollar cost that affects your profitability that it's hard to measure. When you're unable to attract diverse talent, then you have a silo mentality that leads to mismatches in the market and arrogance and competitiveness. We saw that with Silicon Valley Bank. And so we talk about corporate culture on this podcast a lot, and the challenges that startups have in evolving to being not just the cooks in the kitchen, but the whole organization that can work together toward common goals and objectives. Well, my guest, Cary Sparrow, is the founder and CEO of WageScape, where they provide developers, analysts, and consulting firms with access to the world's largest, most up-to-date labor market data collection. Cary is also a former U.S. Navy officer who served on several nuclear submarines, 35 plus years combined of engineering, military consulting, technology, and operations leadership in achieving organizational growth. Cary's going to bring to us the knowledge, experience, and insights so that the decision makers listening, again, all those C-suite people, the investors in these high growth companies, recognizing and anticipating the skill map and navigating this really tricky labor market, needs better data. We forecast supply chain for manufacturing, right? Why aren't we better with forecasting our labor needs? Cary and I are going to dig into this with actionable plans. We're going to talk about keeping up with the competition in a changing market by predicting the future of pay, how compensation is a major factor in success, talent acquisition, and who you compete with for your workers that you may not be thinking about if you're a tech company or whatever. Talent recruiting, identifying, developing skill trends so you can compete in a global hiring market. We're going to talk about that and more. So thank you for listening in. Buckle up. Here we go. Welcome to the show, Cary. Thank you so much for being a guest on the Compassionate Capitalist Show.
Karen, thanks very much for having me.
So before I bore people with statistics and we start getting into all of those kind of numbers, let's talk about, like, how did you go from being on nuclear subs and engineering to being this aggregator and applier of labor statistics? How did that happen? How did you become the CEO of WageScape?
It's a long and winding road, to borrow a phrase. I've always been a geek. I'm wear it as a badge of pride. When I was in high school, I fell in love with computers. I fell in love with programming computers, and I love the idea of building computers. And I went to college at a place in upstate New York, Rensselaer Polytechnic, that at the time had one of 4 computer engineering programs where it wasn't just about programming, but it was about how you design and build computers. This was a long time ago. And to pay for school, I was lucky enough to be awarded a full scholarship by the Navy. So when I got when I graduated, I had the opportunity to serve in the Navy for a few years, and I chose to go into submarines. I was a nuclear submarine officer for 8 years. And by the time I got out, everything that I knew about computers was totally obsolete. I mean, 8 years, 8 years is 3 lifetimes, 4 lifetimes really at the time, as fast as things were developing. And so,
Yeah.
but I got recruited by a management consulting firm that did a lot of data analysis, and they had kind of a technical approach to things. And I kind of got excited about that. And I ended up spending about 15 years at that firm. I started as a junior associate and I left as a managing partner. And along the way, did a lot with really innovative analytic approaches. A lot of what management consultants do is they bring a lot of very powerful analytics to companies to help them see their business in ways that they haven't necessarily done that before. And so I got involved with first of all, building those, and then also building entire businesses around those kind of methods. And in the meantime, managing really big projects with really interesting companies. And when I left there, I went and actually put that into practice as an executive at a really big global company. And so I always had this, this growing kind of, a combination of analytics, engineering, but also kind of organizational perspectives, strategy, and entrepreneurship, right? Finding opportunities. And when I was at my last company, it was really obvious that there was a significant problem with the way that things like pay were being measured. They were being measured very poorly. And as when I went to business school, a lot of my training there was based on economics. And anytime you have a huge market and you have really bad information, that there's tons of efficiency opportunities and innovation opportunities that are just getting wasted. And so I saw that there was a real opportunity to kind of bring more focus on what's actually happening with jobs and pay. I saw it firsthand, and I saw that nobody was really doing anything about it. And so I founded WageScape back in 2015 in order to go after that opportunity. And we did fine to start with. We built a data platform that captures information about who's hiring and how much they're going to be paying for those jobs, what skills they're looking for, and so forth. That over the course of just a few months became the largest in the world of its kind. And we got a few really great clients to start with, but then we got a little bit lucky. The whole world got unlucky, but we got a little bit lucky when the pandemic hit, because the whole labor market went out of bounds and went into total disequilibrium. Nobody knew, wages were going up, but nobody knew by how much. Nobody knew who was hiring, what they needed. Investors were flying blind in terms of who's positioned to be really, to do really well in this. CEOs were flying blind in terms of hiring the teams that they needed, and setting pay policies. And we had all the data that was necessary there. And so we really, over the last 3 years, have seen a real jump in the demand for our services. And so that's kind of the long and winding road that spanned over 30 years.
Okay, so all right, so because I went and I pulled up the Bureau of Labor Statistics, right? The forecast for the next decade, and I had done a podcast. I think it was when we first came out of the pandemic, probably in 2021, with an economics person talking about because I guess the census had come out, and part of what was going to be, we were not going to come out of the labor shortage as people were sort of anticipating. And we talked a little bit before we got started. We'll kind of dig into this, the great resignation that we experienced in the 2020, mostly because there is 2 factors that affect the number of people in the workforce that has been happening. It's been happening for the prior to the pandemic, for like the last 2 decades, and that's a declining population and an aging population that is aging out of the workforce. So the combination, but we have a growing economy, so we have jobs that are being created,
Yep.
right? And then as a result of the CHIPS Act, the Infrastructure Bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, we have all kinds of additional money coming in to build roads and modernize factories and put wire up, because we saw during the pandemic we had a lot of rural areas that did not have internet access and couldn't do digital health and couldn't do, which was affecting the healthcare issues and people be able to get access to healthcare. And so there's money going into doing that. And so we've created whole new segments of potential jobs where there's probably a big mismatch in skill sets, right? So, they're expecting, I think the actual stats are the aging piece is dropping a whole percentage of our population, of our increase in people, whatever. They are forecasting health issues because we have an aging, in the health area. And we had a lot of people, I guess, a mass exodus that was probably part of the Great Resignation, probably came in 2021, where the healthcare industry had been so stretched that many of them had PTSD and could just not do those jobs anymore. And, we've had, as we bring back the manufacturing, and we saw some of this with the labor unions, a lot of that's being automated. It's automation jobs, so it's a different type of job set that they need, a skill set they need, because they need robotics, they need more computer people for cybersecurity, AI, everything going digital, right? So let's get into that and talk about, those are just stats. So let's talk about first, who is it? Only the biggest companies like the GE and the IBMs of the world that employ thousands and thousands of people, that are looking at the trends that you have? Who uses your data? I saw on your website, by the way, everybody, it's wagescape.com, WAGSCAPE.com. Who uses that data besides the biggest companies out there and think tanks? Talk about how.
So all kinds of folks use it. Actually, it's a little deceptive if you don't kind of think deep about it. But we have clients. So we have clients that range from some of the folks that you mentioned, some of the biggest corporations in the world, the biggest consulting firms in the world that want to bring kind of market insights to their clients, but then also recruiters in medium-sized companies, even smaller companies, recruiting firms, hedge funds use our data, banks use our data. They use it for a very different purpose, which is a leading indicator of future business performance of companies, because hiring and hiring health is reflective of business outlook, and matching that up against expectations that management has set is something that firms spend a lot of money on looking at. Yeah, go ahead.
So what is hiring health?
Yeah, so how strong is your hiring? Because hiring is a forward, is a forward indicator, right?
And that's measured by turnover or just
hiring volume. Just hiring volume. So one of the areas that we get data from is we collect a massive amount of data from online job listings. Millions and millions every month. We collect data on in the US, about 85% of all new jobs that are being created. So a massive data set that for any company, you can go in and compare month over month or even week over week for any type of job. What's their hiring pattern look like? And when you see a change in hiring pattern, there's a reason behind it. In most companies, you need, posting a job reflects a commitment and a prediction. It's a commitment because you have to, the hiring manager has to have the budget for it and the approval to post it before it even gets posted. But the job hasn't been hired yet. And so it's a prediction of what will be coming into the company. And so if you see, here's an actual example, We had one group of analysts that was looking at a set of companies, and they noticed that one company had significantly curtailed their hiring of sales positions almost overnight. And in the next quarterly call, they mentioned that they had cut back on sales, and they dropped their revenue outlook as a result of that. So it's one indicator that reflects kind of what the prospects for a company are.
So you can get granular to your so it would be almost like pitch book or something for the M&A space.
Yeah, exactly. When it comes to hiring, right? And so that's the thing that is kind of innovative and disruptive about our data platform, is that it's fully transparent and it's completely granular, meaning you can see, like I said, the sample size is 85% of the economy, down to the individual job and the individual company, fully transparent.
Wow.
And updated every day. So it's a different kind of market intelligence than what people are used to. The kinds of information that people are used to just do not serve us well at all today. It's based on, like if you're talking about pay, it's based on pay of people that already have jobs, based on salary decisions that were made, up to a couple of years ago. And that doesn't do any good if you're, hiring, if you need to be hiring today, which everybody is. Also, because it's fully transparent, it's also very localized. You can see what's going on in your city, in your zip code, whereas traditional data is typically aggregated at the national or the state level. And if you want anything, and so why is that important? To put it in perspective, over the last 2 years, wage inflation has been high. It's coming down, back down closer to historic levels now, but it was running pretty high, more than double historic levels. But the inflation, the rate of increase for advertised wages, so what it takes to hire somebody to come in the door, was going up at 20% a year, 20% a year for 2 years in a row, right? And so that's huge. That's why it's really important, if you're, if you're bringing in talent, or you want to keep your talent, because everyone on your team is a target for someone else's hiring program, that what's going on, because pay, it used to be the saying was people didn't leave because of pay, they left because of bad management and bad culture. Well, if you're going to get a 30 or 40% pay raise by walking down the street, culture is a lot less important reason to stay for a lot, especially when you've got actual inflation at the levels that we've seen it over the last few years. So staying on top of what is going on with wages is now critically important. But the other thing is what's going on with hiring and wages locally is critically important, because those numbers I mentioned, like 20% a year, that's across all jobs across the whole US. But if you get in and you look at individual areas, those numbers could be as high as 80% in parts of Indiana, or as low as -5% in, of all places, San Jose, California, which is where you'd think, tech would be driving wages way up. But cutbacks there have resulted in kind of the opposite effect. So
those
understand,
are highly skilled jobs, though, like
yeah,
those kind of things, right?
Yep. So, but
well,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, we were talking a little bit earlier, and I think it's like triggering in my brain when you're talking, because they're expecting, I think, come first of the year, a couple of different states have mandated increases in minimum wage, right?
Yep.
And so you've got some states where it's gone up to, and there had been a talk at a federal level up at Congress prior to the pandemic of trying to make mandating a minimum wage. And as an economist myself, I've said, well, whenever you mandate that, then it has a ripple effect of price increases, because they're going to pass those increases on, just like the tariffs had a trickle down of increase in prices. They don't, China didn't pay those tariffs. The American public paid those tariffs. And so when it comes to those kind of wage increases, if you mandate that, the cost of living in, like I'm down here in Georgia, you could probably compare it up there up in Minnesota, but out in Dublin, Georgia, which is in the middle of like a bunch of pine trees down a road, what it costs to live there is a lot different than what it costs to live up in, downtown Atlanta. Right.
Right.
And so what you need to, so to mandate the entire state have a minimum, you're going to end up driving up prices in those little towns and hurting the small businesses there, where it needs to be based off of the economics of the different area. That's just been my personal opinion. But you have states that have sort of mandated it, and but like in Georgia, it's still $7.60, right? And so but there's people that have to live here. They can't pick up because if you move to California because it's $20 an hour, well, guess what? It costs a lot more to live in
Right.
California, right? And so, talk a little bit about that aspect of it, because I think jobs themselves, the hourly people, they will, because they want to get a better employee, they'll change what they pay their server or their hourly worker to have a more reliable employee, or to be able to compete against those low wage jobs, kind of a thing. And so there's going to be a natural competition that will raise it up. And that will happen. So address that, but also what you had said before, that companies need to think about, they may, if they're paying hourly wage, they're competing against these other hourly wage jobs when it's something that's not a specific, highly skilled set. So talk a little bit about that overall hourly wage thing, and
Yeah.
what you think's happening and what you see happening based on the trends in reality.
Yeah, I mean, the market is in complete disequilibrium, meaning that, all of your assumptions about how hiring and pay worked economically in the past are no longer, no longer usefully valid. Because yeah, you've got pay going up, and that's just one effect. There's a few others we'll touch on, but let's just take the pay as an example. I live in Minnesota, and as of 2 days ago, the minimum wage up here just went up to just under $16 an hour at the state level, right? So you're in
So
Georgia, and
all the
it's
way. So
right.
little town, big town,
Yep.
everybody's got the same. All right.
The whole thing, right? And so even before that, though, companies were jacking up the pay that they were offering employees, because they had to, in order to find the talent they needed in order to stay in business. And so we had a client that did recruiting for small machine shops in the Midwest, as an example, and their typical, starting rate for a machine operator in those shops was between $15 and $18 an hour. And this was about a year ago. And $15 to $18 an hour is now a typical day shift rate in a lot of quick service restaurants, fast food places. And so if you think you're in one business and that's all, the only place that you've looked in the past for the talent that you need, that's not true anymore. You have to recognize that folks, like I sit on the board of my son's school, and people are leaving teaching, first of all, because it's hard. But secondly, it just doesn't, it pays really poorly. And people are, capitulating and saying, I've got to make a living, so I'm going to go do something else where I can get paid more and I can have a much, better work environment. And so teachers, when we were talking about compensation for teachers, we're saying, we're not competing with, we shouldn't be benchmarking what other schools are doing, because other schools aren't doing any better. We need to look at what other choices teachers have, because that's what we're competing with. And the same applies in any business. And it's true at the hourly level. It's true whether it's skilled or unskilled, but it's also true at the salary level. So, the whole remote work trend, which is a horse that's just not going to go back in that barn, as much as a lot of executives want it to happen. Remote work is another complicating factor that leads to this kind of disequilibrium, because now, employees are realizing, and they've gotten used to the fact that they can work, they can be productive, they can have a fulfilling job, they can stay on a career, they don't have to worry about rigid childcare requirements, they don't have to worry about things like, accommodating for elder care or specific kind of domestic situations that are complicated. They don't have to maintain the same expense for work, and they definitely don't have to deal with commutes. And so when you are able to set up an organization that can really lean into that type of culture that gets the right kind of social interaction within a remote environment, you have a huge competitive advantage compared to the folks that are saying you've got to come into the office with everything else that went with that. And so, yeah, there are companies that are bringing people back into the office, but I think they're doing it not, just with an eye towards what they had in the past, as opposed to an eye towards what their competition, and including competition that they don't even know about, is doing these days. And that's kind of the watchword, which is whoever you thought you were competing against is not really who you're competing against these days.
So the idea of keeping up with the competition in this changing market by predicting the future of pay. How do you predict the future of pay? Do you say, is there something that says, okay, so Minnesota's gone to this, what'd you say, $15, $16 an hour? So the future of pay, because that's for basic level skill, that means that all the skilled laborers are going to go up 15, 20% on top of that. So they have to sort of budget into that. And at what point do because we have this big discrepancy at the higher up level of pay to the lower levels, right? We see that with a lot of spotlight on that in the banking industry, a lot of different, in the finance industry and stuff like that. Will companies have to start saying, okay, we're not going to have this discrepancy. We're going to cut the fat of the C-suite in order to be able to pay our workers more so that we can be more competitive and stay profitable? Where does it come together?
Well, I can't speak to kind of what companies in mass would be doing at the C-suite, other than to say, I doubt, history hasn't really shown a willingness to cut back on C-level pay ever. In fact, I think it's going to continue going in the direction that it has been, because that's a market in its own right, and it's pretty rarefied talent that sits there. I think they're going to be taking it out of the organization and looking at infrastructure costs and looking at organizational efficiency, to be honest with you. There's a variety of factors that companies are dealing with. One is actual inflation, one is wage inflation, another is remote work, another is the hangover effect of the Great Resignation, which I'll come back to in a second. You and I were talking about this a little bit before we started recording this episode. And that's one that's kind of interesting, because in order to create a pretty compelling place to work and to want to stay, employees now recognize that they have choices. And if you're having trouble keeping employees, or you're having trouble finding employees, pay is absolutely a part of it. But a bigger factor anymore, if you're raising pay and still struggling more than you think you should be, because it's tough everywhere, you got to look at how you're set up. Are you offering people the kinds of jobs and the kind of culture that would make them want to work there, because they have more choices than they've ever had before? And if you have crappy jobs, then you're either going to get crappy people or you're going to get no people for those jobs.
So yeah, we talked about remote. So I remember a while back, IBM used to do this. And so tell me if this is something that's still happening. Other factors, because back when we used to how do you attract millennials and have different generations working together and stuff like that? It was sometimes millennials want to have flex. They can work early shifts or things like that. You got people. You got the idea that you get daily pay. You know what I mean? They got those systems that it's electronic and you can get pay. They may bundle in a credit for daycare, or, talk about some of the other things that are perks besides wage that can be a retention factor that you see, or do you measure at WageScape?
Well, one of the first things that companies did coming out of the pandemic was, when they saw that they were going to have to be raising what they offer employees to hire them, was they started significantly emphasizing the benefits that they already offer. Because in a lot of cases, they just never really cared about marketing those, but those became a really, really big deal. And to put it in perspective, about 40% of job ads now have some mention of benefits or bonuses, whereas that number was around 4% prior to the pandemic.
Oh,
And so it's not that they're adopting more benefits or offering more benefits, they're just advertising them a lot more aggressively than they were. There are some things, though, that relate to flexibility, and these haven't shaken out yet by any stretch. There's still, I think we still got a few years before we get to some, a new set of conventional wisdom when it comes to benefits. But things like that offer flexibility, like hours, like allowances for home offices for folks that work in offices at home, different types of dependent benefits, I would say. An ability to work more flexible and part-time, I would say, is becoming more prevalent. But companies are getting more inventive in terms of attracting, recognizing that coming to work, figuratively speaking, has to match with an individual's lifestyle requirements. And so aligning kind of what they offer in terms of benefits or perks or working conditions, and then really making sure that potential employees understand that, and so that they can see how that would differentiate them as an employer, is become really, really, really critical. But like I said, I don't think any of this is shaken out to the point where we can nail specific trends and say that these are now new leading practices. I mean, I give you an example with my company. I wanted a team that could be very flexible. That's how I wanted the organization culture to be. I needed flexible, requirements, because, my wife doesn't have flexibility in terms of her work requirements. She's a first responder. And so I needed to be able to take care of my son, get him to school, handle everything associated with that. So I needed flexible hours, and I built a company that offered that too. And deliberately marketed opportunities to folks like parents that didn't want to come off the career track entirely, but couldn't work full time because of outside commitments. And I have not had a problem finding the talent and keeping the talent that I need, knock on wood. But a traditional view of hiring would say, it's a 40 to 50 hour week. You've got to kind of be in the office, or you've got to be available during a set period of time. If you can't do that, then those are boundaries that we're just not willing to stretch for any individual. And that the notion of kind of typical career boxes, if you will, the typical career paradigm, if companies want to remain competitive, I think the ones that are doing the better job there are taking a really hard look at where there are assumptions about how work needs to be done, when it needs to be done, and where it needs to be done, and setting aside those assumptions, and
yeah.
creating kind of a new norm, if you will, that works for them.
Okay, so in the 10 minutes or so we have left, let's I want to get to the great resignation piece, and I want to talk about the types of skills and the mismatch. And we kind of talked about at the very beginning, maybe before we got started, of shortages that address the different opportunities. So on the great resignation, the thing that I saw in that, because people were given money, and because there was a lot of folks that couldn't work. I saw a lot of people go back and finish degrees or get the second level of skill set that they needed so that they could go get a different job. If they had been, in college and then, liberal arts, whatever, and ended up being in the server industry. And then they were like, oh, I can go get this something, I can finish up a tech degree, or I can get something in the healthcare space, or I can do something else. And they would move towards something they were more passionate about and get the skill sets to be able to do that, particularly when they realized if they had been in the service industry and were doing gig jobs, they only got compensation from the government for one of those gig jobs. And if they needed 3 gig jobs to make ends meet, they really needed to go get a higher level skilled job, because that long term, that wasn't going to cut it for them. So talk about what you've seen in your experience since 2020 with the great resignation, and kind of where that's going and what the outcomes were from that, and your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things that's worth just reiterating is that the Great Resignation, I think was a product of the fact that people just through the situation of the pandemic came to grips with the fact that they have choices. And those choices are not just career choices, they're life choices. And they had the ability then to compare what they had been working on before, what jobs they had before, with what they wanted those choices to be for their lives and their career. And in a lot of cases, there was a big mismatch. And that was viewed as people opting out of the workforce, which I don't think the stats are really bearing out that people are opting out of the workforce as much as it is they're just reconfiguring what they do.
Mhm.
And so, that's a part of it. But what do they do? It's interesting. It's kind of all over the map. Some of them are moving to different places that better fit with kind of what they want their life environment to be like. Others, like you said, are going back to school. One like poster child example of this is the whole data science space or anything around data analytics. That's got to be one of the fastest growing fields of study that universities have been investing in over the past several years. And folks are, that are kind of like me, that have had a thing for data for a long time, are now, saying, hey, I think I could actually have a much better career if I focus just on that. And so, that's an example of going back to school to fill in some of the gaps. In other cases, they're recognizing that some of the skills they have are fungible, right? So certain types of sales will work across industries. Certain, definitely marketing will work across lots of different industries, and companies are beginning to recognize that, and getting more discerning about how important are things like having a 4-year degree or having industry specific experience at a certain level. How essential is that really to performing well in a job? Or are there other factors like learning agility, your ability to jump in, and kind of get to know a situation fast, and you've got the right behaviors to be able to perform, or behaviors themselves like sales behaviors and so forth? How important are those things? Those types of things I think are taking on much more critical importance, which is, folks are recognizing that if you have those, you've got, different options available to you than maybe you did in the past. Another thing that's really interesting, you mentioned kind of the aging workforce. Like 10 years ago, I was on a panel at one of the world's leading universities that was looking at the effects of the aging workforce. And at that time, the fastest growing segment of the workforce in the US, and this applied in most countries outside of the US, was workers over the age of 55, right? And folks are not, except for health reasons, are staying in the workforce longer. So what do you do with those folks, especially when laws are set up that, it's very difficult for companies to adopt policies that they can allow people to move down the career ladder instead of up the career ladder as
Yeah.
as their needs change, right? Companies were not set up to accommodate that. And so what have you seen in the meantime? Just over the last 3 years, you've seen an explosion in fractional executives and fractional managers. And these are folks that have established careers and now are saying, you know what? I can go out and I can fill in gaps in companies, and I can do it on my terms. I can do it on a part-time basis. I can do it a few months out of the year. I can do it full-time if I want to. And I can, really lean into my expertise. And companies, it's a lot lower risk for them as well. They get an experienced person to be able to come in, and as they right the ship or as they build the capabilities, then that person can move on to whatever's next for them, and they can look at who's the right fit for taking things going forward. So that's just an example of, since we both have kind of an economic view of things, we have a supply of labor, which is an aging workforce, and that supply is going to find a demand for itself. It's gonna deploy itself. They're not just going to sit on the sidelines.
Yeah,
So,
and I can see that being one of the ways where they improve their efficiency because they're using those interim execs. They don't have to pay them a full time. They don't
right.
necessarily have to have a full time benefits. Those costs associated within the middle management, if they're not going to adjust the upper management, within middle management and upper, a little bit of upper management, they can adjust as they need to fill out the bottom parts of that and everything. So yeah, and in fact I did I've long been an advocate as a company, a startup grows, to use interim execs. But then now also as a company is scaling and they may not have the need for a full-time CXO, whatever, right?
Mhm.
They can, until they have a need for that full-time kind of a thing, then they can use that. And it's a really great growth strategy for those companies that are in the nano market or mid market kind of a
Well, and
thing.
that's what we do, to be honest with you. And a lot of our roles, especially on the technical side, I use fractional folks all the time. And part of it is all the things that you just said. But the other thing is fast forward 3 or 6 months from now, and our situation will be totally different. And the kind of manager and the kind of exec I need is totally different. Getting somebody that can create something out of thin air is a different skill set than somebody who can take something that already exists and optimize it, right?
Yeah,
And
right.
versus take something that already exists and scale it tremendously. Those are all different profiles. And so, one of the things about being able to, match talent at each of those phases is that you can match the talent with the needs, at those phases, and not just look for one person to carry you all the way through. In some cases, you need that. I've got some people on my team that I brought in deliberately to create, build, grow, and run, and they had the ability to do that. But in a lot of cases, like I myself don't even know what certain things are going to look like 6 months from now. So how
Okay.
could I hire for that?
Yeah, yeah,
You know?
yeah. Yeah, that makes it really hard. So
It-
with the minute or a couple minutes we have left, I really want to get your answer on this.
Mhm.
So how is anybody out there predicting, oh, we are going to need, because they talk about healthcare and tech and things like that, but these other kinds of skilled labor, like we talked about with these different bills and the kind of skilled labor that you need to manage our supply chain, get things off of boats, to build the roads, to, I know there was a small little segment of, some of the stuff within the sustainable, but robotics, fixing robots, right? Is there anybody looking out there and matching up with who's being educated in trade schools, what trade programs are being looked at for that? Or is that really going to be a private sector thing I know I need in my business, I'm going to need these skills, so I have to create some kind of intern or some kind of program to bring those skills on board because it's not being fulfilled in the public sector of education?
Well, I know that at the higher learning levels, so universities and colleges, they're absolutely looking at what's the direction and where are their skills that are going to need to be incorporated. At individual company levels, especially for larger companies, they've been looking at this for a while, even before the pandemic. The whole, what consultants call the future of work trend is looking at how skills are evolving or need to evolve in response to changing organization models and the introduction of artificial intelligence and automation. I would say that when you go to tech conferences in the HR arena, which we do, one of the fastest growing areas of tech applications is looking at the market of skills inside companies and what skills do you actually have and how can you deploy those skills regardless of what you've traditionally thought your boundaries for individual jobs should be. So there's a lot of effort that's going into this. Is it coming up a level? I'm not really sure kind of how well kind of the lens of what is the labor market for skills looking like, how robust that is, at the for the entire economy. I will tell you that it's really dynamic. It's changing all the time. There are certain there are a wide variety of positions and entire fields that are being disrupted by large language models as we speak. So that form of AI, like ChatGPT and others, that is now making it a lot easier to write things that sound really good. And so for writers, it's not 100% of their job that is necessarily being taken over by that, but the job is fundamentally changing in terms of what they're doing. And that's moving fast. There's other things that are longer term things like robotics, and there's other things that are a response, like, all the stores now that allow you to order by app and drive up. That's an organization model and a customer service model that didn't exist 3 years ago.
Right,
So
right.
there was really no way to predict that. If you were, the president of a university, or you were the head of a trade school, or the head of a school board there was no way that you could predict that companies were going to be fundamentally changing how they deal with customer service. The way, so the explosion of those kinds of apps, but also like self-service with cashiers, which has got its own set of controversies, are all responses, I think, to wage pressure and also work condition requirements that came out of the pandemic. And so what we see at WageScape is we see what's happening right now with how companies are defining what they need. So we're able to give a better view of what's happening in the next, say, 6 months, for jobs that are actually going to be hired because of what people are asking for right now. And we can see which skills are becoming more in demand. There's some things there, but I would tell you that there's one other change that we haven't talked about that
Okay.
is going to have a huge impact, is already having an impact in some cases, and that's around equity. And I'm not talking about ownership equity. I'm talking about pay equity. So
Yeah.
pay transparency and pay equity are driving forces in terms of how companies are going to have to manage their workforce, especially as they set pay policies and attract and retain their workers. And they're poorly equipped now to do that. And so we're getting involved with more and more companies that are, startup companies, or small tech companies that are bringing transparency to what the equity picture looks like within organizations and also across markets. And you're going to see a lot more transparency coming up over the next, definitely over the remainder of this year, but for several years.
Is
And
that
that's going to be shocking to people, I think.
is that transparency between equity in between men and women, between black and white, or is it the equity between the different levels within the company, or all of the
All of the
above?
above, all of the above. I think right now, um, social equity as defined by gender and ethnicity is getting a lot of attention, but the kinds of tools that you need in order to shine a light on that equity picture are exactly the same tools that'll show you what's going on by level, that show you where you've got career pathing issues within your own organization that are excluding women, as an example, from advancing to the degree that their potential suggests they should be able to. So there's lots of tools that are going to be coming onto the market. We're going to be a part of that. But this whole notion of transparency is a huge trend that's also a horse that's not going back in its barn.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining in on the Compassionate Capitalist Show, Cary. Again, wagescape.com, and link is in the show notes. Also, if you want the Bureau, Labor Bureau stats, you can look at that. That's in the show notes. Please go to karenrands.com as well to learn about all my stuff, and onwards and upwards. Cary, thank you so much for being a guest today.
Hey, it's been my pleasure. I love talking with you guys.